I recommend people go check out the Arvol channel with his interview with Joel Davis. And I've watched a few Joel Davis videos. It was much more comprehensible, much more easy to follow along with what he was saying when it was with an interview with Arvol. What I wanted to sort of discuss today is the concept of perfectionism and feudalism. Not feudalism, not the system of feudal lords, but futilism, futility. Futility is an important concept. It's important that we recognize actions as futile. Futility is essentially anti-hedonism. We might engage in hedonistic behavior, but we might realize that that behavior is futile. So we might get a dopamine rush from playing video games. We might get a dopamine rush from chasing members of the opposite sex. We might get a dopamine rush from eating. But we ultimately recognize that certain activities, while they might seem like a good idea in the short term, they are futile in the long term. We might pursue various paths or goals. In the short term, they might seem very advantageous. So we might experience alienation, and as a short-term response to that alienation, that social isolation, we might engage in extreme extroversion that is aided by the use of drugs. So, alcohol-fueled parties, drug-fueled parties. All of these things might work. They might be functional in moderation. We could talk about a functional, successful alcoholic, someone who drinks weekly or daily to excess, but they're still successful, functional, according to their own metrics. But sometimes people get to a point where they say, my alcohol use is no longer functional, and the way that I'm living is a futile way to live my life. I need to change course. So the concept of futility is important. If we didn't ever have a concept of futility, we might endlessly pursue dead ends. Whether we're talking about a dead-end job, dead-end drug use, dead-end romantic lifestyle, whatever we're talking about, futility is important. So when someone says, I feel this is futile, or what I would describe as a feeling of futilism or futilism, this is not always a bad thing. I think every basic emotion that we have in our psychological toolbox serves some positive role. Now, it's not to say that we can't have dysfunction, where we feel sad all the time, we feel depressed, and that prevents us from acting. Sometimes sadness is an important motivator in terms of decentivizing certain forms of behavior, incentivizing other forms of behavior. It repels us from certain things. It discourages us from certain things. Oftentimes, sadness is in response to loss. And so this feeling of loss that we have then incentivizes us toward loss prevention. That is, we're more careful, more conscientious, whatever it is, whether it's in personal relationships or dealing with material objects. So negative emotions, like the feeling that a path is futile, is advantageous. Now, there are certain cases where perfectionism is necessary, and perfectionism I'm going to describe as the opposite of futilism, in that there are cases in which all apparent signs and signals might point someone in the direction of feeling that their course of action is futile, but because of their perfectionism, they're able to overcome that. So there are many cases, there are many examples, many stories, rags to riches stories, where someone was turned down, refused, and they could have given up and gone home and lived a mediocre life, but they persisted, they kept trying, they sacrificed everything in order to achieve their goal. And certainly this is possible. It's certainly possible to have someone who is a perfectionist who never stops seeking their goal, because we have in life, we have sort of what we might call thresholds. So in any case, let's say you're trying to build a business. And in order to build this business, you first have to purchase a warehouse, you have to hire employees, you have to train the employees, you have to buy equipment, you have to buy uniforms. There's so much that goes into the starting of the business to the point where you can actually open the doors. You can't open the doors, like let's say it costs $10,000 to rent the warehouse, and it costs $10,000 to hire a few employees, and it costs $10,000 to do this, and then it costs $5 to rent or buy a uniform. If you spent all that money but you didn't hit the threshold, that is, you didn't get everything that you needed in place to start the business, and you said, you know what, I've spent $10,000 here, $10,000 there, $10,000 here, $10,000 there, I still am not ready to start the business, I'm going to give up, because it's crazy to keep doing the same thing over and over and again without, achieving some result. The problem there is that there are thresholds. Economic thresholds, in the case where you need to spend a certain amount of money in order to get a certain result. These are hard and fast thresholds. It's not everything is gradual, and see, that's the appeal of video games. Often in video games, there's a training with skill training, or whatever the level is, the difficulty of the enemies, whatever. There's some kind of gradual increase in difficulty where you beat level 1, level 1's relatively easy. You beat level 2, okay, level 2 had some challenge, but it was also very easy. Level 3, it wasn't that easy, but it was easy enough, and so on and so forth. You see the gradual escalation of difficulty in video games. And that hacks into our brain, because when we see a gradual escalation in difficulty, what this signals to the brain psychologically is that we come to feel less futile. The futilism is less activated when we see this gradual increase in difficulty. We say, okay, well, this level is only slightly harder than the last level, so I'm sure that if I just put in a little extra effort, then I can eventually beat this level. Whereas if you had a game where the first level was the final boss, no one wants to play that video game. Unfortunately, that's what real life is often about. Real life, sometimes your first interaction with an academic subject, with an economic project, a business project, a financial project, sometimes your first interaction with a relationship is the final boss. Sometimes you meet, your first impression of someone is that person is having the worst day of their life, or you're having the worst day of your life, and that still is the first impression. Sometimes a business venture is at first disastrous. It's a catastrophe, and the hardest part of starting a business is starting the business. It's opening on day one. It's not 5 years down the line. 5 years down the line, things are much easier. And you have to understand that video games are constructed in order to attract people to them. Video games offer a challenge. They offer rules. So people who say, oh, people love freedom. People don't love freedom. People love rules, but they love a gradual structure to the rules, and that there's this gradual increase in difficulty over time. But that's not how life is. Life sort of hits you like a brick wall, and all the various challenges that we experience in our personal life and in public life, there are many thresholds. And so perfectionism is necessary. It is necessary to be monomaniacal. It is necessary in certain cases to be obsessive. It is necessary in some cases to be addictive. We talk about people who are workaholics. Well, certain tasks in this world cannot be serviced, cannot be solved, cannot be addressed without a workaholic mindset. You need people in this world who are absolutely dedicated, who are willing to work long hours. If you didn't have that, then we would not have the level of economic development that we had. All of the wealth that you have today is due to your ancestors or other people's ancestors doing things that were quite extreme. Working in extremely dangerous conditions, working extremely long hours, working extremely hard, working with a determination, working from sunset to sundown, and when they're not working, they're sleeping. There's an incredible amount of work that has gone into constructing the civilization that we have today, and one of the problems is that we're in this coasting mode where so much has been done to construct civilization, and now we're sort of resting on the laurels of civilization and we're just coasting. And there's not this constant gradual increase, because that's what we're instinctively, evolutionarily, we're trying to detect what courses of action are futile and what courses of action have a necessary threshold. When is perfectionism necessary? When is gradualism or futilism necessary? And you can look at different populations. There are some populations which are obsessive, and you look at Northeast Asians and Northwest Europeans, who, interestingly, geographically both exist sort of on the peripheries of the Eurasian continent, on the northeast periphery, and they are both, closely associated with island archipelagos in Northwest Europe. You have the British Isles. In Northeast Asia, you have the Japanese archipelago. You have these two zones where you still to this day find extremely obsessive, competitive, perfectionist people. When we talk about certain, there used to be StarCraft. I don't follow video games all that closely, but I know there were StarCraft competitions where the Koreans tended to dominate. There are other, apparently, CSGO, I think, is the new shooting game that's competitive in esports, and it seems that Europeans seem to dominate it. There's a lot of money to be made in these esports, and we would compare different continents of people, different populations and subpopulations, and ask which seem to be disproportionately represented in these groups. And that's something I'm interested in, is disproportionate representation in various fields. When we look at sprinting and we look at the population subgroups that are successful there, obviously there is a monomania that is required, and that monomania is fed by dopamine cycles. And so you have a subpopulation of people who they go running and they get a dopamine burst from this. Some people, when they run, they don't get any dopamine burst at all. Part of that is genetic, part of that is environmental, part of that is if you run every day, eventually you might break through a threshold where all of a sudden running becomes fun. But at first it might not be so fun. So, we can look at different populations in their own monomania. One population of people, their monomania might be sexual. So their dopamine cycling is very prominent in the sexual arena, where you have males who are constantly chasing females, or females who are constantly chasing males, and they're just cycling through partner after partner after partner, experience after experience. You have other people who their dopamine cycling might be more targeted toward video games, another dopamine cycling more targeted toward math problems, another dopamine cycling more toward food. So we can look at different populations and see how they have different obesity rates. So we can compare all of these things, and it's very interesting, and we can then look at ourselves personally. We can ask, we have our own dopamine cycle. We experience various things, whether it's exercise or personal relationships, sexual relationships. We experience dopamine cycling, but not everyone's the same. We don't all have the same dopamine reaction to different forms of activity, and we have to recognize that inequality of humanity. And then in our own lives, we have to ask, okay, what is my natural inclination in terms of my dopamine cycle response? Where is it strongest? Where is it weakest? Am I focused on the sexual? Am I focused on the social? Am I focused on the mathematic? Am I focused on athletics? And again, it's not that everyone is going to be one thing only, but that people are going to have different levels of sensitivity to different kinds of activities, and that is going to be partially genetic in origin, and it's going to be partly environmental. And so with that knowledge, you can then assess yourself more accurately, you can assess your strengths and weaknesses more accurately, and you can better project what sort of actions are going to be futile for you. If you have a real strong inclination toward athletics, then maybe it would be smart to engage with that, because that's a field that you have a big advantage in. Some people hate exercise. You naturally love exercise, and so that's maybe something you should engage with on a daily basis. On the other hand, you have to recognize, okay, I'm biased toward exercise, so that means I might need to pay special attention and make a conscious effort to develop my skills in non-athletic areas, because those are the areas that I'm going to be lacking. Recognizing the plasticity of the brain, that you are not a tabula rasa, but there is a degree of plasticity. And so that means that you can redirect your attention, especially at a young age. That's why I think reaching young people and having young people understand psychology is so very important, because really the only time when psychology is effective, or the time when it's most effective at least, is in your youth. And so if we can teach young people, hey, this is how the brain works, this is how psychology works, here's how you can hack into your own development. I mean, there are a lot of young men who they're young and they grow into adolescence and then they grow into young adulthood, and they look at themselves in the mirror and they don't like what they see. They don't like their physique, they don't like their face, they don't like a lot of their physical aspects. Now, at a certain point, once you've reached adulthood, it's very difficult to turn all of that around and change it. Whereas it's a lot easier to affect it. I'm not saying you can entirely change all of these things, because again, a lot of them are genetically influenced in a strong way, but you can change a lot of these things in young adulthood, where you can change your diet, and that's going to change your testosterone. If you stop consuming xenoestrogens, if you stay away from plastic containers, stay away from certain soy products, if you can actually eat more red meat and you can get it to the point where it's grass-fed, minimal pesticides, this sort of thing, if you can adjust your diet at a young age, it's going to have exponential effects over the course of your lifespan. Whereas if you discover this sort of stuff in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, and later, it's going to have a lot less of an effect. So I think it's sort of backwards and criminal the way that our education system works, where oftentimes we're so focused on teaching people facts and figures in terms of, we want them to know historical dates, or we want them to know a certain mathematical method, or we want them to know, how to calculate certain things, or we want them to know how who the first president was. And we call people stupid and we call people ignorant if they don't understand basic historical facts. Oh, you don't know George Washington was the first president of America. Oh, you don't know what 2 + 2 is. Or, of course, basic arithmetic is very basic, but I think it's much less important to memorize abstract facts about the world, trivia, really. I mean, game shows like Jeopardy, sort of Wikipedia facts, people reading through Wikipedia articles, being able to know a little bit about everything, having that breadth of knowledge, being able to say, oh, well, I can put in my 2 cents, I have my opinion about this and that and the other thing. And actually the lack of comfort we have with ignorance, and I think this comes out of the scholastic age of the idea, I think it's the Venerable Bede, was this back in the 8th to 12th centuries, that people had this conception in Europe that you could know everything. You could know pretty much everything there is to know about everything. Now, we've kind of dispelled that myth, but there's still a cultural attachment to the concept of knowing a little bit about everything, to the extent that you're called ignorant if you don't know basic facts. But we live in an internet age where all of this stuff can be outsourced to computers that are a lot better at searching for information, a lot better at retaining and storing information than we are. So I actually don't need to memorize who the first president was. Unfortunately, I have already, but it's actually better if we can put less emphasis, especially for young people, on those sort of things, and instead we should emphasize things that have to do with their health, with their psychology. Not telling people, okay, here's the first president, here's, the geography. And this is something that people often complain about. Oh, Americans don't know geography. They don't know all the countries of Europe. They don't know all the states of America. Well, these are things that can be looked up fairly easily. If you ever need the information, you can get it very quickly. So memorizing these things, understanding these things, having these things in the back of your mind at all times is not really important. What's more important is that people understand whatever your goal is, it doesn't really matter. I'm not here necessarily to prescribe a goal for you, to tell you what to think or what to do or what is good and what is evil, but I'm saying that if you have in your mind already a conception of good and evil, of how you want to be, of how you don't want to be, here are some tools that you could use to actually to grow yourself in the direction that you want to grow. Not the direction I want you to grow in, but the direction you want to grow in. And these are very basic fundamental things. And I reference diet because diet is something that is somewhat immutable, in the sense that things like calories, proteins, vitamins, these are basic chemical building blocks that you can't philosophize about. You can't abstract them away. You can't, and some people try. I mean, you have Jordan Peterson saying he has an all meat diet. You have people who are vegans. So you have people who are perhaps going outside the bounds of science and prescribing different diets. But diet is something where the chemical meets the psychological, and that's not something that we can say in a lot of other areas of life. So we can't say that the social sciences are chemistry. We can't say that, so many, a policy, should we have a ban on guns or should we have, freedom to bear arms? Well, we can't really study biology or chemistry to get a direct answer to that question, whereas diet is something which is pretty direct and scientific and has a huge impact on people's psychology and how you think, on how well you think. It's linked with different political opinions that, people who are more fit, who are more athletic, tend to have, in the American context, what's called a more right-wing political viewpoint, especially for men. This is something that we can really directly measure with a high degree of accuracy relative to everything else. So diet is important, psychology is important, understanding these things. Understanding addiction, I think, if we stop focusing on, okay, well, the opiates are the problem now, but it used to be crack, and it used to be heroin, and cigarettes are the problem, but now it's e-cigarettes. So rather than focusing in on the individual drug, or teens are engaging in risky sexual behavior, teens are having pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies, rather than focus on the individual outcome or the individual negative aspect, why is there no general course on addiction in general, dopamine in general? Just the concept of futilism, and maybe these concepts are too abstract for people to wrap their minds around. But I think there's a huge advantage to giving people fundamental tools rather than handing them results of like, well, you don't want to be a teen mother, so here's how we prevent that, here's how you use a condom. Instead saying, well, here's a general problem of people engaging in risky behaviors because they don't have resources. They don't feel like they can talk to their parents. They don't feel like they can talk to people at school. They don't have a social structure of people who are more experienced than them, who care about them, who they're comfortable with. That's something that people used to have. It's something we don't have today. So how do we address that problem on a fundamental level rather than just addressing the specific symptom of, oh, it's manifesting as unwanted teenage pregnancies, so let's specifically attack throw condoms at these teenagers. Well, maybe if they had a working relationship with their parents, then that wouldn't happen. Maybe they would have that relationship if their parents weren't divorced. Maybe we wouldn't have divorce if we changed, the economic dynamic between men and women. So there's a lot of things we can do where rather than looking at the symptom and then telling the people affected by it to, hey, you need to use this prophylactic, you need to use this preventative, you need to use this counteractive measurement. Like you have diabetes, so here's some pills to fix your diabetes. Well, instead of using something after the fact, why don't we have preventative methods? Instead of trying to address diabetes after it's already manifested itself, why don't we try to instruct people on the dangers, and it doesn't even have to be an intellectual thing. It can be fat shaming. I think fat shaming can be effective. I think shaming in general is effective. The concept of shaming is effective. I don't think shaming is a cancer. I mean, you have some people who look at homosexuality and they'll say something like, homosexuality is a sin against God and it's evil and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, why are people gay then? We can ask that sort of Epicurean question. I think that's the right term. Let's see, God is evil. Is there... we can ask that sort of question. I'm going to just leave it at that. And, it's called the problem of evil. We can ask that sort of question about homosexuality, and people see the flaw there. But if I ask you something like, why is there shaming? Shaming is almost viewed as this, how should I say it, this original sin, or it's something that humanity is like, it's built into us. which is how I view it. But some people view it as like we're tabula rasa. We don't have to be a shaming culture if we don't want to. We can eliminate shaming. But there is Nazi shaming. You're shamed for being a racist. You're shamed for being sexist. You're shamed for being a Nazi. So it seems to me that shaming does work. It does work to shame. If you shame people for being racist, people won't be outwardly racist. If you shame people for being fat, maybe they'll just come up with ways to stop being so fat. It seems that shaming does work. Now, shaming, of course, can traumatize people. There can be adverse effects of shaming. If you shame people, perhaps someday they're going to come to the school with a weapon and try to hurt people because they perceive it as bullying. Some people, the shaming might cause, other psychological problems, other psychological hang-ups. So there are, of course, negative consequences to shaming. But my argument is that so long as we have any kind of morality whatsoever, we're always going to have shaming. And I don't think there's a way outside of morality. I don't think you can really name an individual or society that is amoral. So we're always going to have shaming. The question is, who gets shamed and why? What's our justification? What are our interests? I think it's in the interest of individuals not to be fat. I think it's in the interest of society not to have obesity. And so I think fat shaming, by that token, if anything, should be shamed. I think fatness should be shamed. Again, the argument that it's sadistic to shame people, well, that's a fair argument. That's true. It is sadistic to shame people. It is mean to shame people. It does hurt people to shame people in the same way that it hurts me when I am sad. When I am angry, when I'm sad, when I'm depressed, that hurts me. It hurts me on an emotional level. It hurts me on a psychological level, not physically necessarily. But there is a pain. There is an emotional pain associated with negative emotions. And so there is a pain, there is a cost we are inflicting on people when we shame them. Words do hurt people. It's not as if you can shame people and bully people and that's not going to hurt them. It does hurt them, and sometimes that pain is temporary, in the same way you might break a bone and it might heal completely, but other cases there are pains and there are diseases and there are wounds that are inflicted that might never heal. That's true physically, that's true emotionally. So we do have to understand the power of shaming, and of course the best thing to do would be to offer positive reasons not to be fat, because it's a lot less damaging. And I think the Pavlov experiments with dogs, he showed that if you ring a bell and you give a dog a treat, the dog salivates. There's a Pavlovian response. So I think usually when we're trying to condition people socially or behaviorally, we do have to recognize that positive incentives are much more powerful and useful than negative incentives. So, positive incentives can be multiplied and added, and they can gradually increase. You have a lot more freedom when you have positive incentives, whereas negative incentives, there's sort of a limit that you have with negative incentives. You can, with a dog and a treat, you can give a dog 1 million treats over many years for many little different good behaviors. If you beat your dog every time your dog doesn't do the right behavior, well, eventually you're going to have a dead dog, essentially. There's only so much beating that you can give people physically. And that's true emotionally as well. There's only so many times that you can berate someone and shame someone before they become apathetic, before they become indifferent, before they become depressed. Because depression, in my mind, is really it's a form of emotional, it's a form of generalized futilism, where someone just feels that everything is futile because they've just been beaten into the ground by circumstances. Or one could argue for a chemical source of depression. It doesn't really matter. But, there's only so much negativity that we can put out and expect to gain something positive out of that. It's much easier to do something, with positive incentives, which is why, our capitalism tends to be a more powerful system than communism. Or communism, you say, well, if you don't show up to work, we're going to put you in a gulag. Capitalism says if you do show up to work, you'll earn a paycheck. Now, of course, actual state communism they did have wages. They did have things that were, you might consider to be capitalist. market-based solutions. Pure communism has never been tried, right? So, I'm sure even in North Korea they give positive incentives to people. So to truly have a scenario where there are no positive incentives, where there are only negative incentives, very difficult. It's much easier to have a pure positive system, or at least something closer to a pure positive system. That said, even in a society in which you said we're only going to be positive and no negativity is allowed, in that society, you still have a situation where people who argue against this central tenet itself are then shamed. When you encounter someone who is conservative or someone who's intolerant, someone who's bigoted, you can expect a Facebook post or something about, no one can judge me, and these people are horrible, these people are fascists and Nazis and intolerant bigots. We have slur words that are directed toward people who are exclusive or conservative or who want to impose social rules on us. So that is somewhat paradoxical, but really we haven't evolved. We haven't changed our basic social mechanisms that involve both positive and negative means of encouraging or discouraging behaviors. It's just we've evolved the ideological, abstract, linguistic framework that we use to justify and explain and describe and construct and provide scaffolding for the system that we have. It was interesting to hear Joel Davis say that he did not believe it was reasonable to try to conspire to overthrow the global power structure. Instead, he said a much more reasonable goal, a realistic goal, is to try to conspire with the global power structure, to try to become useful to the global power structure, to ingratiate oneself, to come up with some sort of product or service. And Joel Davis, he was saying, basically it's going to be a think tank. But it could be an economic function, it could be a social function, it could be an ideological function. There's so many different functions that are needed today that one could provide to the global power structure that would then make oneself invaluable to the global power structure. And, I think that ultimately that positive view of, look, there is a global power structure and we can either fight it tooth and nail and we can kill ourselves in the process, because if we sacrifice every last drop of blood, we might impose great costs on the global power structure, but ultimately we are smaller than the global power structure, and so we're ultimately going to lose. I think World War II is a great example of, you had a country that was willing to sacrifice huge amounts of men and material. It was willing to fight to the last man and last drop of blood and everything, and still it as a whole, as a system, was smaller than the surrounding nations, the opponent nations. And so it ultimately, even though it was able to inflict greater casualties on the enemy, still it was not a viable strategy. And so rather than sacrificing ourselves to spitefully inflict wounds on people we don't like, if we can instead find a way to become useful to the people who are, taking negative actions against us, then we could actually, I think in my mind, better survive. And that's an interesting question, the question of ethos versus ethnos. Ethnos simply meaning a population, a group, an in-group, an identity group. Not necessarily an ethnic group, but using it in a more general sense. And then ethos is, of course, morality. And you come to a contradiction where you have people who are self-described, white nationalists or identitarians or nationalists or whatever, and they say, we can never use deception, or we can never ally with the globalists, or we can never be traitors, or we can never do this or that. And they make all these rules. And you say, well, what if changing your group survival strategy was actually going to allow you to have a better chance of survival? And the way I look at it is that we have a scenario in which a huge number of people, 10, 20, 30, and Mitt Romney put figures up to, 47% of people are net tax receivers rather than net taxpayers. So we're looking at the pace of automation. We're looking at a situation where a vast number of people are going to become outmoded and outdated and obsolete and replaceable by machines, and they really are they don't have the cognitive capacity to ever contribute to society in the coming decades. And so, you have to ask, are you wedded to these people? That's a question people have to ask, but it's interesting how people often pose it as an ethnic question. They say, well, the white elite is allying with the globalists to attack the white working class. And I have to ask people, well, are you the white working class? And is that your station? Is that an indelible part of you? Are you willing to sacrifice your own survival in order to maintain your loyalty to a white working class? Or are you going to recognize that in this capitalist evolutionary system, there are going to be winners, there are going to be losers, and are you going to choose to be on the winning side rather than the losing side? These are questions that people should ask, and they should have, what you usually get from these people are axiomatic responses. You get axiomatic responses like, I won't allow you to deconstruct my race, or I won't allow you to, question my loyalty, or whatever the response is. And I understand that at some point everybody has their axioms, but you do have to ask, what are your axioms? Would you rather be the beautiful loser or the ugly winner? And when I look at world history, not just anthropocentric history, but when I look at the survival and the thriving of insects on this planet, if you actually, what's the study? Entomology. If you take entomology seriously and you realize that insects are some of the most successful species, and by many metrics, they're more successful than humanity. The concept that humanity is the most successful species on the planet really, to me, is without weight. It's extremely biased and subjective, and seems to be according to no objective standard, other than, I suppose, we've gone to space. But we haven't colonized space. We're not reproducing on the moon. We're not reproducing in space shuttles. So that remains to be seen. If we can colonize other planets, then certainly that would give us an evolutionary advantage over species that couldn't. But of course, we contain species, parasites, bacteria that we'll carry with us, that ultimately you could say, well, those parasites, that bacteria is just as successful. It hasn't done the work, but it's come up with a strategy to effectively catapult it into space. Pretty amazing, pretty successful. So, yeah, we have to ask ourselves, these insects, by anthropocentric standards, are so ugly, and yet they're so much more successful. So if really all you care about is survival, then you have to ask yourself, are you willing to change your system of aesthetics? If aesthetics is the most foundational, important thing to your identity, to your axioms of good and bad, and what you want and what you hate, then you ultimately are conceding that success is not your greatest, or I should qualify that survival is not your greatest goal. So it's interesting how people state things like, the survival of the nation is the most important thing, or the survival of the race, or the survival of the ethnic group, or the flourishing. We have to prevent the genocide of this people, the genocide of that people. Often it's based on, they put it in terms of survival, and they put it in terms of pragmatism, and they say, well, culture is nice and culture is great, but we can't have culture without the genetic infrastructure to create that culture. And I get that argument, I understand that argument, and my argument would be, well, rather than trying to preserve 800 million white people, why not recognize that really the traits that have made white people so successful are actually most present in a small percentage of the overall white population, and really that's the percentage of the population that you want to preserve and protect, and the other percentage, and whatever that, it could be an 80-20 split, it could be a 50-50, however you decide, whatever your metrics are, but you could say that other population, the survival of that population is not really important. And you do see this manifest sometimes with the distinction between like a Zoomer and a Boomer. So saying that, well, boomers are white, but boomers are on the way out, they're dying off, they're not important, so we don't need to ideologically reach boomers because boomers don't matter. So already there, you're engaging in the process that I would say is an ethical distinction. You're distinguishing between people not just on their ancestry, not just on their lineage, not just on the blood that flows through their veins or anything like that, not their theoretical potential or theoretic affiliation with a population group that produced certain individuals or certain systematic societal structures that created civilization. You're admitting that that's not really at the core what you care about. What you care about are the results, the things that have been produced by this system. You don't care about each and every individual within that structure. And so if this is actually your thinking, then if you happen to be in a scenario where the white working class is becoming obsolete, it's experiencing a divorce boom, it's experiencing a suicide boom, it's experiencing a drug boom, you have to ask yourself, are your efforts going to be focused on addressing these questions? That's the first question I would ask people. And the second question is, are you going to focus your efforts on trolling and shaming and punishing and harassing people who are the architects of the destruction of the white working class? And the way I look at it is, again, it's a question of threshold here. So it's an objective question, and it's not one that I can readily answer without empirical data that, frankly, I don't really have. So I'm sort of agnostic on it at this point. And maybe I'll obtain that at some point, and I'll be able to marshal some evidence either way. But my contention is that we're entering a transhuman age. We're entering an age of transformation, that humanity is we're going beyond humanity. Of course, Nietzsche predicted this, and others before him, perhaps. I mean, Nietzsche, of course, was drawing heavily from Schopenhauer, from ancient authors, from ancient Vedic sources, Christian sources, Buddhist sources, and Platonic sources, ancient Greek sources. So, from my perspective, a lot of the technology that we have is really foreshadowed and, in fact, created by the desire for that technology to exist in the first place. I believe that there are certain cases where people say, oh, well, someone was tinkering with a machine and they created something with an unintended function and unintended use. My opinion is that's problematic. It's a problematic narrative. I think the only reason inventions are ever recognized as inventions is because there was some demand for it, either by the inventor himself or by the wider society. And so maybe the demand wasn't there within the inventor himself, but there was some demand out there in the wider society. So from my perspective, invention of technology has to be preceded by the desire, the will for that invention to come into being. And so our entire technological society had to actually be preceded by the desire for this society to come into being. And my opinion is that humanity acts as a hive mind in which our own individual wills come together to actually form a larger will that individually might not be decipherable. So if I say this is the letter A, and I ask you to derive some kind of meaning from the letter A, you could say, well, A is an indefinite article. A has a grammatical function. A has a variant called and we could describe this A and its meaning. But then if I add a C, I say you have an A and then you have a C. What's that? AC. I don't know. It's an acronym. Who knows what AC is? And then I keep adding letters, A, C, A, R. Okay, a car. Okay, right, now that has an emergent meaning. It's all constituted from these fundamental letters, but a car has a totalistic, holistic meaning. A car, well, that's a car. You can never look at the individual letters and decipher the big picture. And I think that's often how world historical processes work, is that we can't decipher from any individual person the general will of the society. And so this is sort of positing the idea that essentially different societies have different souls, and that these souls themselves have wills, which are constructs of the individuals which make up that society, but that the will or the soul of that society as a whole might not be apparent by psychologizing, analyzing the individuals within that society. And so I essentially believe that the work of social scientists and philosophers and people like Carl Jung, they're trying to decipher the collective unconscious, and they're trying, people like Nietzsche were trying to look at society and say, okay, what is the general will? What is the will of society? What is the will of Faustian civilization, of Western civilization, as Spengler put it? What are we going towards? What do we want to do? What is our next step? And so they predicted this transcendence of humanity, going beyond humanity, long before we actually had the technology to enable us to transcend humanity. In fact, we don't technically have it today, but we're on the cusp of it. We might have it, in some Chinese laboratory somewhere, but it hasn't been mass produced. But really, there are very few barriers to making the existent technology a mass producible technology. And if you look at the amount of money that especially Westerners spend on education, they spend tens of thousands of dollars every year on their children so that they can be educated. And when we understand that, then what we can also understand is that people would definitely be willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars to genetically modify their children, to make them something more than human, something better than human. So we're on the cusp of this. We're on the cusp of what JF or Jean-Francois Guérepi calls the phenotypic revolution, and I don't think he's the first one to come up with this idea, but I think he is trying to popularize the idea, and he's coming at it from a negative perspective. I'm coming at it from a much more objective perspective of saying this is what's happening. This process has been underway for a very, very long time, and we're really on the cusp of something new, to the point where there's so much inertia behind this idea and this process that really we don't have the forces, we don't have enough forces to marshal a counter-reaction. At this point, the train is going so fast that we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough manpower to stop the train. And so at this point, it is sort of an inevitability. And when you understand the inevitability of a phenotypic revolution, then you understand that really what matters more than your ancestry necessarily is your ability to put ethics into practice in future generations. What I mean by ethics is just most generally standards by which we judge behavior and psychology. So some people would look at a man who is extremely sexually successful, like his sexual organs are huge, he has huge muscles, he has a handsome chiseled face, he talks well with women, he can dance well, he has charisma, he smells good, whatever, all these phenotypic, some people would call this superficial, but he's very successful with women. Now there are some people who would say that the most important thing in life is to be an alpha male, the most important thing in life is to be a pickup artist, the most important thing in life is to sleep with as many women as possible. That's what determines an alpha male. It doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor, it doesn't matter if you're smart or dumb. What matters is if you can have sex with a lot of women, and if you can be the bull rather than the cuck. And the worst thing in life is being a cuck, which is an interesting ethical concept in itself. So the term cuck contains within it an ethical code saying that you cannot and you should not be a sexual loser, which implies that this is a priority. It's a priority for you to win in the game of sexuality in the sexual marketplace. And if you don't play, well, you lose by default, right? So the idea that all those other men are getting the nut and you're at home, you're reading Plato, you're a cuck, right? They're all cucking you. They're all sleeping with women and you're at home wishing you could be that guy, theoretically. There's an ethical code to that. There's an ethical code saying that some behaviors, and there's an ideal model of who a man should be, what a man should be. There are other models of ethics that say a man should study Torah all day, and a man should adhere to extremely stringent and arbitrary rules surrounding the Sabbath, surrounding dietary regulations. So that is an ethical code, and if we look at these two ethical codes, one saying that really the ideal man is a playa versus the ideal man is a rabbi. If we look at those two ethical codes, and then we look at how those two ethical codes actually interact with the civilizational environment that we have, I think we see that the playa has a lot less civilizational power than the rabbi. And I think you can look at the relationship between Donald Trump and Jared Kushner as a great example, or not just Jared Kushner, but the whole Kushner family. And actually, there's a very good book that's come out called Kushner Inc. that goes into the relationship not just between Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, but the entire Kushner family. So I suggest people look up, and if you don't want to buy the book or read it yourself, you can find book reviews online of Kushner Inc. But it's very interesting how Donald Trump really is that charismatic guy. He is that ladies' man. He's grabbing women by the genitals, and he's so rich, and his wealth is not from his intellect. His wealth is not from anything that he does physically, mentally. It's by his brand recognition. So people recognize him as an actor. He's an actor on a reality TV show, and he uses his charisma, he uses his force of personality to gather a cult around him, and he influences that cult to gain viewers and voters, and he uses his brand to succeed, and he sells his brand. Someone like Kushner has no brand to sell. He has no charisma. He has no ability to gather a cult following. He has no likability. This is pretty much the opposite of Donald Trump. And yet if you look, Donald Trump, if we take him at his word, now of course this analysis isn't very good if you consider the idea that maybe Donald Trump never really intended to fulfill any of his campaign promises. In fact, he was doing that cynically, and he's a brilliant actor who can just lie to people and tell them the opposite of what he actually intends. He just tells people what they want to hear, and that's possible, I suppose. But an alternative explanation is actually a little bit simpler, just to say that there may have been a little bit of that, but that Trump would not have minded to fulfill his campaign promises. If no one stood in his way, he would have got the Muslim ban. If no one stood in his way, then he would have been able to build his wall. If no one stood in his way, then he would have been able to. But the fact is, he has continued to write executive orders and make certain policy directives, and they are continuously thwarted, whereas someone like Jared Kushner, you look at his policy objectives, and a lot more of his policy objectives have been completed, not because he's charismatic, not because he has a good brand. The Kushner brand is dirty. I mean, his father is a criminal. But despite the fact that he has significant problems with branding and charisma and just being a personable, likable, social person, he does have a network behind him, not just him as an individual, but a network behind him which is focused on deceit and behind-the-scenes manipulation and manipulating people like Trump. And I think that's a much more successful survival strategy. And so if someone was to tell me that they were really concerned about their ethnic group and the survival of their ethnic group, I would say, well, it seems like a really good strategy in the digital age is to use means of deception and manipulation behind the scenes, and to manipulate the players of this world. Why was Donald Trump mentioned in so many rap videos and so many rap songs prior to his presidency? He represented ostensive wealth. He represented wealth which was in your face, wealth which was performative wealth which was almost theatrical, right? Gold-plated walls, gold-plated toilets, having Playboy girls all around, sort of Hugh Hefner lifestyle, having a Miss America or a Miss Universe contest, having all these beautiful wives, having all these golf courses, having all these buildings, whatever, Trump in big giant gold letters. So this is the kind of power, this very apparent surface level superficial power that appealed to certain segments of the rap genre, artists within the rap genre. You look on the other hand, no one's really making reference to Jared Kushner. But Jared Kushner seems to be a much more effective, powerful person in terms of promoting the survival of his people and promoting his own goals. So it would seem that just a superficial analysis would say, oh, Donald Trump is more powerful than Jared Kushner. But a deeper level analysis would indicate that actually, Trump is not playing 4D chess. He's just sort of blundering and blustering his way around, and he is on the surface powerful, and he is on the surface wealthy, and he's on the surface a historical agent, but behind the scenes, he's just a puppet. He's just an actor. He's just a playa. And there's no real substance to him, and he has no real power, and he's controlled by more powerful, manipulative, deceitful agents who work behind the scenes who, they're not able to be charismatic. They're not able to be out in front there, and it's actually threatening for them to display their power, because when people recognize them for who they are and how powerful they are, people are jealous of power. People see rich people and powerful people, and they almost instinctively want to steal from them. They feel jealous, especially people who hide in the shadows, people who make their money through finance. Finance, you're not getting your hands dirty. You're not putting in long hours. You're using insider trading most of the time, and most of these people don't get caught. Some people do, like Ivan Boesky back in the 80s, or whoever the Wolf of Wall Street guy was. But most people do not get caught. Most people like Carl Icahn, they get away with it. I mean, currency manipulation, George Soros, he's not in jail right now. The question of is deception ethical, that's a fundamental question. If the answer is no, you're not willing to use deception, a systematic theory of deception and manipulation along the lines of pill pull, or along the lines of Sun Tzu's Art of War, or something like that. If you're not willing to engage with that and use that, then what you're saying to me is that you care more about ethics than you care about your physical material survival as a group in this world. You care less about your ancestral lineage, you care less about the blood pumping through your veins, and you care more about the ethical content of that blood, or the symbolic representation of that blood is really just representing an ethical tradition of chivalry and knighthood and honor and open-handedness and honesty. The idea that it's better to die as an honest man than to live as a deceitful man, which is a Christian concept. These are important fundamental questions that people should ask. So I ultimately feel like the questions here are moral and they're ethical, and they really have nothing to do with ancestry or lineage. That seems to be fairly irrelevant, that you can have people from the same ancestry, same lineage, who come to very different conclusions. I mean, like Christopher Hitchens and Peter Hitchens, both brothers, both very different politically. I'm not sure what they agreed on, actually. But both highly intelligent, right? So they both had a lot of probably genetic resources that they both shared in terms of their intelligence, but came to very different conclusions, promoted very different causes. I would say ultimately Christopher Hitchens was a lot more successful than Peter Hitchens in promoting an ideology and becoming famous and having an impact on the global conversation. Peter Hitchens has always struck me as, what do you call it? What's the nice word? As unassuming, futilistic, as someone who, sees history headed away from his conservative direction. He's just sad about it, and he's Spenglerian in the sense of being like the Roman centurion who stands at his post while Vesuvius explodes. And that's sort of what this transhuman moment is, that social categories are changing very rapidly. Technology has transformed the concept of work away from being centered around manual labor, and now it's centered around services and customer service and pretending to be someone's friend and making sales and things like that. So the nature of work has changed, and that's changed the way we view something as biological as gender. All these things are changing, and if you're just sort of clinging to old ethical systems without recognizing that technology has changed the rules of the game, then it is really like standing before an erupting volcano. It is like trying to stop a moving train. It really is like trying to steer a sinking ship or something. It is sort of from my perspective, it's sort of a futile exercise. And people can say, well, we've seen civilizational cycles. Spangler described the rise and the fall of the Greeks, the rise and the fall of the Egyptians, the rise and the fall of the Romans. We know that in each time they started off with Puritan ethics and hardcore ethics, and then at the end they degenerated and became tolerant and accepted members of all classes and all genders and all races and ethnic groups, and then they fell and they collapsed. That's the story that's told, although this whole time the general global story has been in favor of greater globalism, larger populations, more anonymous populations, the increasing class differentials, the difference between the poorest person and the richest person continues to increase globally. So all of these questions, all of these problems, people can look at a civilizational cycle and say, well, this is some absolute law that eventually we're going to collapse and have to go back to some neo-puritanical system. But one could actually look above the cycle and see the cycle really as the turning of a wheel, and we've been headed in this direction for a very long time, which I would say is a consequence of urbanism, which is sort of a consequence of the agricultural revolution. And we're not going to turn back the hands of the agricultural revolution. We're just, the effects and the results and the symptoms are unfolding as a result. I think, to me, it's amazing how the agricultural revolution, from my perspective, started a process that really, you can think of it as the spark that has resulted in a phenotypic or genetic revolution, that we're now feeling the final or last effects, where we're finally ready to move into a post-human era. It's always interesting to hear Alex Jones talk about these things with candor, even if he elaborates or exaggerates or he says things that aren't true, whatever. Just the general premise of the concept of transhumanism, he just describes it as automatically evil, the concept that, there's not enough free will involved here. I don't know. I think there are a lot of people who are addicted to various substances who don't have a lot of free will. I think, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers living in a tribe don't have a lot of free will. They can either live within the tribe and live by the tribe's rules, or they can go die. And there's not a lot of free will involved in that. We can either join with this transhumanist system, we can become a part of it, we can encourage its growth, or in a lot of cases we can die. People can disagree with me, people can say that the system is collapsing, but I would say that the collapse of Egypt, the collapse of Greece, the collapse of Rome, the collapse of various empires over time, even we could look at the collapse of ancient India, the collapse of China at various periods, especially in the 20th century, China seemed to collapse. There are a lot of different collapses locally as systems exhaust themselves, as they become inelastic, as they become unable to adapt and evolve over time, but that these systems seem to always pass on knowledge to, the Greeks learned from the Egyptians and the Romans learned from the Greeks and we learned from the Romans, and someone's going to learn from us. So I'm not saying specifically that America as a global hegemonic global empire won't collapse. That could very well happen at some point in the future, but at the same time, the people of the future are going to learn from America and America's mistakes. They're going to build a better system. But the global trends that we've seen in the last 10,000 years since the start of the Neolithic, or even going back to the replacement of Neanderthals with Homo sapiens, all of these trends at the same time seem to be increasing in the same way that I would make an analogy to the human body, where we have many cells that individually are growing and decaying and dying, and growing and decaying and dying. This cycle is happening, with millions or billions of cells inside the human body all the time, and yet we're continuously, while we have all these births and deaths going on inside of us, we're continuously moving toward goals and objectives and completing certain things, and we're actually moving forward in our life. So even though individual empires, they grow and they die, sure, but overall, humanity as a whole is actually progressing in a certain direction. There are actually systems of philosophy that are evolving, that are building upon one another, that are leading to technological revolutions, and the human system as a whole does seem to be moving in a direction. It doesn't seem to be purely cyclical. Now, you could argue that the whole thing is futile, or the whole thing is within some greater cyclical perspective, that humanity as a whole is growing, but at some point we're going to stagnate and collapse as an entire system, and that's all possible. I won't deny that. But at the same time, denying all of the changes that we've experienced and acting as if we can apply old ethical systems to the present scenario and expect to have the similar success of people in the past is just not realistic. It's just not empirical, right? It's not related to reality. It's sort of substituting your own historical fantasy of how things used to be because you have a instinctual, intuitive attachment for whatever reason to mores of the past. And I'm not I try to be sympathetic to people. I try not to be I try to understand people and where they come from, because I think at the end of the day, if you ever want to convince people, it's not necessarily the best idea to come at them with vitriol and I try to engage or listen in or follow dialogues between different groups of people. And certainly if you throw slurs at, if you go up to a woman and you call her a slut or whore or feminist, you throw vitriol at her, then you can't reasonably expect that she's going to convert to your side. Maybe she will. Maybe you have a view of female psychology, the Islamic view, where you just sort of show her the strong horse and the weak horse, and she goes for the strong horse. That's why feminists are converting to Islam. That's entirely possible. But in terms of what are we saying here? This is funny. What were we talking about? If you approach someone and you just say you're stupid and you don't matter and everything you say is wrong and blah blah blah, I mean, you can do that. I don't think that's really effective at transforming people's minds. I think you do have to have sympathy for people, understand where they're coming from. The attachments that people have are very real, and whether or not they're able to break out of those attachments into something new, into a new paradigm, really relies upon their ability to be introspective and to understand, okay, what are my fundamental axioms? Where do they contradict? Where do they agree? And how am I going to move forward? Am I going to cling to one axiom over another? Do I have a justification for that? And at the end of the day, I do see value in what Joel Davis is saying, in that I can try to make a reasoned, abstract argument to someone about why they should or shouldn't be attached to a certain axiom or certain ethical principle. But at the end of the day, reasoned argumentation, rationality is not the basis of decision making. Man is not, at his basis, the definition of man is not the rational animal. The definition of man, his most fundamental nature, is his animal nature, is his willing nature, is his desiring nature. It's not something that distinguishes us from other animals, that actually we understand ourselves as part of the animal kingdom, I think is a much more accurate. To understand ourselves as more similar to animals than more dissimilar is a more accurate model. And it's sort of an anti-anthropocentric model. So I think that's enough for now. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.